Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the heiress who inherited more than she bargained for. A tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant, investigative mind. But before that, I want to say, you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. A Most Curious Invitation. The rain pattered gently against the windows of our modest yet comfortable lodgings in London, creating a rhythmic accompaniment to the quiet crackling of the fire. I had been engaged in a rather lackluster attempt at reading the morning paper when a sudden rustling broke my concentration. Across from me, seated with his usual impeccable posture, was Hercule Poirot, his delicate fingers adjusting a perfectly straight line in his already pristine moustache. I had come to recognize this gesture. It was the prelude to a declaration of great importance. "My dear Hastings," Poirot said, his voice carrying its familiar Belgian lilt, "I perceive that the post today brings something of interest." I set my paper aside and turned my attention to the single envelope in his hands. The parchment was thick, cream-coloured, and bore an embossed seal, Montclair Estate. The name rang a distant bell, but it was Poirot who voiced the connection. "First, the Montclairs," he mused, tapping the envelope lightly against his fingertips. "A name of wealth, of old money, n'est-ce pas? The patriarch, Charles Montclair, passed away quite recently, if I am not mistaken." "You never are," I remarked, with a smile. Poirot's lips twitched, but he refrained from outright agreeing. Instead, he reached for his letter opener and, with meticulous precision, slit open the envelope. As he unfolded the paper, his expression sharpened from mild curiosity to keen interest. He began to read aloud, "Monsieur Poirot, I write to you in great distress and urgency. Since my father's passing, I have become the sole heir to his estate, and with it a heavy burden. I am being watched, followed, though by whom I cannot say. There have been incidents, small at first, but growing in their menace. Strange sounds in the night. A figure lurking in the gardens, papers disturbed in my father's study. I fear I am not safe. I implore you, Monsieur Poirot, come to Montclair Manor. I am not prone to hysteria, but I believe my life is in danger. Time is of the essence. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Montclair." There was a pause after he finished reading, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. I found myself leaning forward, my mind already alive with speculation. "A young woman, newly orphaned and newly wealthy," I mused. "It wouldn't be the first time we've seen such circumstances lead to trouble." "Precisely, mon ami." Poirot held the letter delicately between his fingertips, as though weighing its every word. "It is, as you say, not an unfamiliar tale. Yet there is something curious." I frowned. "Curious?" Poirot tapped the paper. "She writes that she is being watched, that she hears strange noises, that her father's study has been disturbed. All seemingly minor occurrences. No? But look at the way she phrases it, growing in menace. It suggests an orchestrated pattern, a deliberate escalation." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His eyes gleamed with sharp intelligence. "Someone, Hastings, is playing a game with Mademoiselle Montclair, a slow, creeping intimidation, and such a game, mon ami, often ends in something far more final." The weight of his words settled between us. I glanced back at the letter, suddenly feeling the same foreboding that seemed to have gripped Beatrice Montclair. "What do you think we should do?" I asked. Poirot smiled slightly, as if the answer was self-evident. "But of course we must go to Montclair Manor at once." I should have known that Poirot had already made up his mind. He stood, smoothing the front of his immaculate grey suit, and reached for his hat. "The little grey cells, they have been ignited. And where there is fear, where there is mystery, there is often—" He paused, raising a dramatic finger. "Murder?" I finished for him. He gave a small, approving nod. "Let us hope, mon ami, that this time we are not too late." As he moved toward the door, I found myself swallowing an unexpected chill. The letter, the urgency, the sense of encroaching danger, it all carried the distinct scent of something sinister, and in that moment I knew this case would be no ordinary one. Chapter 2. A death at midnight. The journey to Montclair Manor was uneventful, yet I could not shake the sense of foreboding that had settled upon me ever since Poirot had read Beatrice Montclair's letter. The English countryside rolled past, us in misty shades of green and grey, the sky overcast with the promise of rain. Poirot, seated across from me in the carriage, remained contemplatively silent for the better part of the journey, save for the occasional meticulous adjustment of his cuffs or the absent-minded smoothing of his already immaculate moustache. At last, I could bear the suspense no longer. "You've been terribly quiet, Poirot," I said, shifting in my seat. "I suppose you already—"
"Have a theory?" Poirot looked up with a small, knowing smile. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, a theory? Non, not yet. But an impression, perhaps. Mademoiselle Montclair fears for her life, but from what we do not yet know, is it the fear of something real, or merely the imaginings of a young woman left too suddenly alone?" I frowned. "Surely—"
"You don't think she's exaggerating?" "Not at all, but before we decide what is true and what is not, we must first observe." I sighed, resigning myself to waiting, contented myself with watching the road as we neared our destination. Montclair Manor soon loomed into view, a great stone house, its dark, ivy-clad façade standing against the dull grey sky like a relic from another time. It was an estate that spoke of old money, of generations that had lived and died within its walls. Yet despite its grandeur, there was something distinctly unwelcoming about it. A tall, thin woman awaited us at the entrance, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the mild chill in the air. As we stepped down from the carriage, her sharp gaze landed on Poirot with a look of faint distaste, though she was too well bred to let it fully show. "You must be Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was cool, measured. "I am Margaret Montclair." "The stepmother," I muttered under my breath. Poirot shot me a quick glance, but chose to ignore my remark. "Madame Montclair," he said, offering a small bow. "It is a pleasure." "That remains to be seen." Her lips curved into the semblance of a smile, though it did little to reach her eyes. "Beatrice is expecting you. I trust your journey was comfortable." Before we could respond, a voice called out from behind us. "New arrivals, I see. How very exciting." A young man, no older than 30, strode toward us with an easy confidence. He was well dressed, though there was a certain careless air about him, the sort of man who wore fine clothes but never quite managed to look respectable in them. His dark eyes gleamed with amusement as he extended a hand. "Reginald Blake," he said, "but everyone calls me Reggie. I hope you're ready for a spot of adventure, Monsieur Poirot. You'll find this house is full of ghosts." Poirot studied him with mild interest. "Ah, but it is not ghosts that trouble me, monsieur. It is the living." Reggie's grin widened. "Then you'll find plenty to interest you here." Margaret sighed. Reginald, must you always be so dramatic? Not at all, Reggie replied lightly. I leave that to Beatrice. Poirot said nothing, but observed the exchange keenly. Margaret turned back to us. You will, of course, wish to see Beatrice immediately. Follow me. She led us through the dimly lit halls of Montclair Manor, the wooden floors creaking softly beneath our feet. The house smelled faintly of polished wood, old books, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. We found Beatrice in the study, seated by the fire. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her mid-20s, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her features delicate, yet unmistakably anxious. She looked up as we entered, and when she spoke, her voice was a mixture of relief and apprehension. Monsieur Poirot, she breathed. Thank God you're here. Poirot inclined his head. Mademoiselle Montclair, you have had some troubling days, I think. Beatrice gave a small, humorless laugh. You could say that. I don't know if I'm imagining things or if someone truly means me harm, but She broke off, shaking her head. It's difficult to explain. Try, if you please, Poirot said gently. She hesitated, then began. It started after my father's funeral. At first, it was small things. Papers moved, drawers unlocked when I was certain I had locked them. Then I started hearing noises at night. Footsteps outside my room. Once, I woke up to find my bedroom door ajar when I distinctly remember closing it. And then... She swallowed. Then there was the figure in the garden. A figure? I repeated. She nodded. A man, I think. I saw him standing near the old fountain late one night. But when I called out, he vanished into the trees. Poirot steepled his fingers. And you are quite sure it was not a trick of the light, mademoiselle? Beatrice's jaw tightened. I know what I saw. Margaret let out a weary sigh. Honestly, Beatrice, you're working yourself into a state. The house is old, noises happen, and as for the garden, anyone could have wandered in. Beatrice's hands clenched in her lap, but she said nothing. Poirot studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You have done well to call me, mademoiselle. I will see what I can uncover. That night, after an uneasy dinner where the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions, Poirot and I retired to our rooms. I had just begun to doze when I was startled awake by a frantic pounding at my door. It was Elsie, the maid. Her face was pale as she gasped, Monsieur Poirot, it's Miss Montclair. She's... She couldn't finish. Poirot was already moving. I followed as we rushed to Beatrice's room. The door was locked from the inside. It took several hard shoves before it burst open. Beatrice lay motionless on the bed, her dark eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Beside her, a glass of champagne had been knocked over, its contents pooling on the floor. Poirot bent over the body, his expression unreadable. Then softly, he murmured, It is as I feared, Hastings. I swallowed hard. You mean... Yes.
Mon ami, he said, straightening. Mademoiselle Montclair has been murdered. Chapter 3. The crime scene and first clues. The room was deathly still.
The overturned champagne glass lay where it had fallen, its golden contents seeping into the thick Persian rug. Beatrice Montclair, so full of fear just hours earlier, lay motionless, her once lively features now frozen in an expression of dreadful surprise. Poirot, his posture uncharacteristically stiff, stood beside the bed, his sharp eyes scanning every detail of the scene with deliberate care. I swallowed against the unease curling in my stomach. Poirot, what do you make of it? Without
answering, he knelt beside the body, his delicate fingers pressing lightly against Beatrice's wrist, though we both knew there would be no pulse.
He placed his palm against her cheek, then gently lifted one eyelid before sitting back on his heels, his lips pursed in thought. She has been dead for, what would you say, Hastings? An hour, perhaps 2, I started. Good heavens, how should I know? He sighed. Ah, but mon ami, observe! The body is still warm, the muscles only just beginning to stiffen. The time of death must be quite recent. His eyes flickered to the overturned glass. You see, Hastings, here is our first mystery. The drink was spilled, yes, but was it before or after Mademoiselle lost consciousness? I frowned, stepping closer. Surely it must have been before. If she had been poisoned, she would have dropped it in the struggle. Would she? Poirot mused. Or did someone arrange it, so we should think so? He reached for the glass and examined it closely, his nose wrinkling in dissatisfaction. Tell me, Hastings, what do you smell? I hesitated, then bent to sniff the rim. Nothing. Precisely. Poirot's expression darkened. And what does that tell us? Blinked.
I don't know. Should it smell of something?
If the poison were cyanide, there would be the distinct scent of bitter almonds. Poirot tapped a finger against his temple. But there is nothing, which means, my friend, that the method of poisoning was either exceedingly subtle or this was not poisoning at all. The thought chilled me. Then how? Poirot held up a hand, signalling for silence. He turned to the maid, Elsie Carter, who had been hovering at the doorway, her hands trembling. Mademoiselle, he said gently, you were the one who discovered the body, yes? Elsie nodded rapidly, her breath coming in short gasps. Yes, sir, I was bringing up a cup of tea, like I always do before Miss Montclair retires. But when I knocked, there was no answer. That wasn't like her, sir. She always said, come in. So I tried the door, but it was locked, and that's when
I got scared.
You say the door was locked, Poirot repeated. From the inside? Yes, sir. Poirot glanced at the door, his brow furrowing in concentration. He stepped forward and tested the lock. It turned easily now, having been broken open by force. And before that, you heard nothing unusual? No cry for help? Elsie hesitated. No, sir, but... But? Poirot prompted, her fingers twisted in her apron. I did hear something earlier, footsteps, in the hallway. What time was this? Around 11, I think. I wasn't paying much attention at first. But then I heard something else, a sort of soft thud, like something falling. I exchanged a glance with Poirot. Could that have been the glass falling? I asked. Poirot shook his head. A possibility, but let us not assume. I turned back to Elsie. Did you see anyone in the corridor? No, sir. But... Her face tightened. Miss Montclair had been terribly anxious these past few days. She kept saying she wasn't safe. She told me just yesterday that if
anything happened to her, I should... She clamped her mouth shut abruptly. Poirot's gaze sharpened.
You should... What, mademoiselle? Elsie shook her head, biting her lip. I don't know. It was just a passing comment. Nevertheless, mademoiselle, I must ask you to try and remember. Poirot's voice was firm, but not unkind. Elsie hesitated, then blurted, She said that if something happened, I should tell someone that she had changed her will. A stunned silence fell over the room. I recovered first. Changed her will? Are you certain? Elsie nodded wide-eyed. She said she was going to do it yesterday. That's all I know, I swear. Poirot's fingers drummed against his chin. And tell me, mademoiselle, who else knew about this? Elsie hesitated. I don't know, sir, but Mr. Devlin, Her father's solicitor was here yesterday. Maybe he would know. Poirot gave a satisfied nod. Bon, we shall speak to this Mr. Devlin at once. Elsie's expression was one of immense relief. Thank you, sir. I do hope you find out who did this. Poirot turned back to Beatrice's lifeless form, his expression unreadable. Oh, mademoiselle, he murmured, that you may be assured I shall. With that he straightened, his keen eyes sweeping the room one last time. Then with a decisive nod he turned to me. Hastings, we must waste no time. There are many questions still unanswered. Who had reason to fear this change in will? Who was awake at the time of the crime? And, most importantly, he paused at the door, his expression grave. How does one die of poison, with no trace of poison at all? The night air outside was cold and still. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked and an owl hooted mournfully. I felt the weight of the mystery pressing in around us. Poirot strode purposefully down the corridor, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. I hurried after him, my pulse quickening. The case had begun in earnest. Chapter 4. Suspects and Secrets. Poirot sat upright in the Grand Montclair drawing room, his hands resting neatly upon his knees. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the polished wood panelling. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Beatrice's sudden death pressing upon us all. Margaret Montclair, the late Mr. Montclair's second wife, sat poised in a high-backed chair, her lips set in a tight line. Across from her, Reggie Blake lounged against the piano, idly turning a silver cigarette case between his fingers. Mr. Horace Devlin, the family solicitor, stood near the window, his expression unreadable as he observed the scene. Poirot's sharp gaze moved from one to the other, his little grey cells already at work. "My friends," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "it is of the utmost importance that we understand Mademoiselle Montclair's final days. In cases such as these, it is often the small things, les petites choses, that reveal the truth." Margaret Montclair gave a delicate sigh. "I suppose you must do your duty, Monsieur Poirot, though I fail to see the point. The poor girl suffered from terrible nerves. She was bound to have an accident eventually." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "You believe her death to be an accident, madame?" A slight pause. She was always fretting about something. If not the inheritance, then some imagined threat. She was unstable. I bristled at her casual dismissal of Beatrice's fears, but Poirot merely inclined his head. "And yet, madame, you chose to remain here with her?" "That suggests you had some fondness for your stepdaughter, no?" Margaret gave a thin smile. "I had an obligation. My late husband's will provided for me to stay at Montclair Estate as long as Beatrice remained unmarried. Now, of course—" She trailed off, her gaze flickering toward Mr. Devlin. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "And this arrangement, was it a source of tension between you?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Not at all." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you say she was anxious about her inheritance. Did she speak of making any changes to her will?" Margaret's face remained impassive. "If she did, she certainly didn't discuss them with me." Poirot turned to Mr. Devlin, who cleared his throat. "Miss Montclair did, in fact, request a meeting with me the day before her death. She wished to make amendments to her will, but she was rather vague about the details. She seemed uncertain." "Uncertain?" Poirot's brows lifted. Was it hesitation or fear? Devlin hesitated. It was difficult to say. She was uneasy about something, but she did not elaborate. Poirot steepled his fingers. "And do you know who stood to benefit from the new will?" "Not precisely. She had not yet signed anything." "Then we must consider who had the most to lose." Poirot's gaze flickered to Reggie Blake, who had been watching the exchange with an air of detached amusement. "Me?" Reggie chuckled. "I rather think you're barking up the wrong tree, old chap. Beatrice and I were always quite friendly. Not that it would have mattered. I wasn't about to inherit a single penny either way." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but you were quite devoted to the Montclair estate, were you not?" Reggie exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "I enjoy the finer things in life, Monsieur Poirot, but I wouldn't stoop to murder for them. Besides, the old girl wouldn't have disinherited me. She hadn't included me in the first place." Poirot said nothing, merely watching him with that piercing gaze of his. Reggie met his stare with easy confidence, but something in his manner struck me as too composed, too indifferent. Poirot suddenly shifted his focus. "Tell me, monsieur, was there another person who held influence over Mademoiselle Montclair? Someone she confided in, perhaps?" Margaret's lips thinned. "If you're asking about that insufferable Dr. Fraser, then yes, she trusted him far too much." Mr. Devlin glanced at her sharply. "Dr. Lionel Fraser was Beatrice's personal physician, but I see no reason to suspect him." "I do," Margaret said coolly. "He was here the night she died, wasn't he?" Poirot's expression remained impassive. "He was seen near her room." Reggie flicked the ash from his cigarette. "Elsie mentioned seeing a shadow in the corridor. Could have been the doctor." Poirot turned to Devlin. "Do you know why Dr. Fraser was here?" Devlin hesitated. "He often came to see Beatrice in the evenings. She suffered from severe anxiety and he prescribed her something to help her sleep." Poirot's expression sharpened. Ah, sedative?" "Yes." "A mild one?" Poirot's fingers tapped the armrest. "And yet she died of poisoning." Devlin stiffened. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing, monsieur," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "I merely observe that Mademoiselle Montclair was under the care of a doctor who had access to medicines and who was present on the night she died." Margaret sniffed. "Well, if you ask me, the man was far too involved in Beatrice's affairs. She trusted him more than she trusted her own family." "Indeed?" Poirot's gaze flickered with interest. "And did this trust extend to financial
matters, perhaps?" Devlin cleared his throat. "Dr. Fraser was an advisor of sorts. Beatrice was fond of discussing matters of the estate with him." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A doctor concerned with finance?" Reggie smirked.
"He wouldn't be the first." Poirot straightened, smoothing his lapels. "Messieurs, madame, I thank you for your time. I shall speak to Dr. Fraser myself." As we left the drawing-room, I turned to Poirot. "Do you really think Fraser might have had a hand in this?" Poirot gave a slight smile. "Hastings more."
I think many people had a hand in this. The question is, whose hand tipped the scales of fate?"
Ahead of us, the hall stretched long and shadowed. Somewhere in this house, the truth lay hidden, and Poirot intended to find it. Chapter 5. The mysterious letter. The air in Beatrice Montclair's bedroom was still heavy with the scent of stale perfume and burnt paper. The fire in the ornate marble hearth had long since died down, leaving only a few charred remnants of what had once been a letter. Poirot, ever meticulous, knelt by the grate, his gloved fingers delicately sifting through the ashes. "Mon Dieu, Hastings," he murmured, extracting a half-burned scrap of parchment with his tweezers. Observe, if you please. Someone was most anxious to destroy this letter, and yet... He turned the fragment over with the utmost care, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Not quite anxious enough. I leaned in, peering over his shoulder. The paper was brittle, its edges blackened, but a few words remained legible in faded ink. You must believe me, Beatrice. You are in grave danger. The rest of the message was lost to the flames, but in the lower right corner a single letter had survived. I let out an exclamation. Poirot, this is it. This is the proof we need. The sender must have been Dr. Lionel Fraser. Who else could it be? Poirot gave me a look of mild amusement. Ah, Hastings, ever the champion of the obvious solution. But consider, mon ami, if Dr. Fraser had truly written this letter to warn Mademoiselle Montclair, why would he then seek to harm her? Perhaps she confronted him, I suggested. Perhaps she discovered something incriminating and he silenced her before she could act. Poirot clicked his tongue. A possibility, but one that lacks the finesse of a true criminal mind.
No, Hastings. This letter presents us with two important questions. Who wrote it, and why was it burned? He folded the fragment carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Rising to his feet, he took one final glance around the room before dusting his hands together. Come, mon ami, we must speak with Dr. Fraser at once.
As we descended the grand staircase, I could not help but feel that we were drawing closer to the heart of the mystery. The discovery of the letter changed everything. Someone had known Beatrice was in danger. Someone had tried to warn her, and now she was dead. We found Dr. Lionel Fraser in the study, seated in a leather armchair, his long fingers tapping idly against the armrest. He was a man of sharp features, with an intelligent gaze that seemed to measure everything it rested upon. "Ah, gentlemen," he said coolly as we entered, "I expected you might wish to speak with me again." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, Doctor, I must trouble you with a question of some importance. Tell me, did you write to Mademoiselle Montclair?" "Before her death?" Fraser's brow furrowed. "Write to her? No, certainly not. Are you quite certain?" "Of course." Poirot produced the fragment of the letter and held it up between two fingers. "Then how do you explain this?" Fraser's eyes flickered to the scrap of parchment. For a brief moment I thought I saw something pass across his face. Recognition, perhaps, but it was gone almost as soon as it had appeared. "I have no explanation," he said calmly. "That is not my handwriting, if that is what you are suggesting." Poirot examined him with keen interest. "And yet, Doctor, your name begins with an L." "As do many others," Fraser countered smoothly. I opened my mouth to protest, but Poirot silenced me with a glance. "Tell me, Doctor," he continued, "how well did you know Mademoiselle Montclair?" Hercule hesitated. "I was her physician, nothing more." "And yet you visited her quite frequently. She suffered from acute anxiety. I prescribed her a mild sedative to help her sleep." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Was she afraid of something?" Fraser exhaled, his fingers drumming against the chair. "She was troubled. She believed she was being watched. She spoke of hearing footsteps outside her room at night, of letters arriving with no sender. I assured her it was nothing, that her mind was simply playing tricks on her." "Did you believe that?" He hesitated, just for a second. "At the time, yes." Poirot studied him in silence, then nodded. "That will be all for now, Doctor. Merci." As we left the study, I turned to Poirot, indignant. "You let him off too easily, Poirot. That letter was addressed to Beatrice, warning her of danger. Who else but Fraser could have written it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "You see only what is before. you, Hastings, but I see a larger picture. Someone wanted Mademoiselle Montclair to fear for her life. Someone wanted her to be unsteady, uncertain. And then when the time was right, they struck. You mean the letter was part of a scheme? Perhaps. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Or perhaps it was the final warning of someone who cared. He paused, at the foot of the staircase, glancing back toward the study. One thing is certain, mon ami, the writer of that letter was trying to protect her, and now they are either dead or afraid to speak. I shivered. There was something in Poirot's voice that sent a chill through me. Come, Hastings, we have much to uncover. We left the Montclair estate, stepping into the cool night air. Somewhere in the darkness, the truth waited to be found. Chapter 6. The Locked Room Puzzle. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Beatrice Montclair's bedroom, casting long shadows across the ornate furnishings. Poirot stood at the foot of the bed, his small frame rigid with concentration. He had been silent for several minutes, his gaze flitting between the locked door, the bolted windows, and the cold fireplace. Hastings, ever the impatient one, finally spoke. Poirot, you're certain this was murder, but how in heaven's name did the killer escape? The door was locked from the inside, the windows were undisturbed, and there's no secret passage to speak of. Poirot turned to him, a small smile, tugging at the corners of his lips. Ah, mon ami, but have we not learned that in a crime most impossible there lies a trick most simple? Hastings sighed. I suppose you mean to say the answer is staring us in the face. Precisement. Poirot gestured around the room with a flourish. Let us consider what we know. Mademoiselle Montclair retired to bed at approximately 11 o'clock. She locked her door, as was her habit. Shortly after midnight she was found lifeless, her champagne glass overturned upon the nightstand. He gestured toward the door. When forced open, the door remained locked from within. And yet the killer, poof, vanished into thin air. Hastings frowned. It sounds impossible. Poirot's eyes twinkled. And yet it is not. Let us, for the sake of the little Graycells, reconstruct the events of that fateful night. He stepped toward the door, closing it gently before turning the key in the lock. Voila, the scene is set. Hastings, play the role of Beatrice Montclair. You are in your room, ready for sleep. There is a knock at the door. Hastings hesitated. Well, do I answer it? Mais oui. You are an heiress, not a ghost. Hastings cleared his throat and made a great show of stepping toward the door. Who is it? He called dramatically. Poirot smirked. Ah, Hastings, you must practice the subtlety, but never mind. You go to the door. You unlock it. Hastings obliged, turning the key with a click. And you admit your visitor. Poirot stepped inside, assuming the role of the unknown guest. But what happens next? Hastings gestured helplessly. I suppose I drink my champagne? Poirot nodded. Oui. But now comes the clever part. The visitor, our murderer, ensures that Mademoiselle Montclair is indisposed. His voice lowered. A sedative, perhaps? Something in her drink? Hastings looked at the overturned glass on the nightstand. But we found no trace of poison. Poirot tapped his temple. Patience, mon ami, we shall come to that. Now the visitor leaves, but before they do, they must ensure the room is locked once more. He stepped back into the corridor and closed the door. Hastings stared at it. But that's just it, Poirot. How could they lock it from the inside? Poirot grinned. Ah, and there, Hastings, lies the answer. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a thin wire with a small hook at the end. With great care, he inserted it through the keyhole and gave a gentle twist. With an audible click, the lock turned. Hastings gasped. "Good Lord! Not magic, mon ami, mechanics." Poirot tucked the wire away. The murderer had a similar tool. They locked the door from the outside, knowing it would appear impenetrable.
A locked room mystery, c'est magnifique. Hastings shook his head in admiration. But that means the killer was no amateur. They planned every detail. Exactement. Poirot's expression darkened. And that, Hastings, tells us something. Most important, this was not a crime of passion. It was premeditated.
At that moment, the sound of a footstep in the corridor drew their attention. Margaret Montclair stood just outside the door, her gaze lingering on the fireplace. Poirot tilted his head, watching her closely. "Madame," he greeted her smoothly.
You have an interest in the hearth? Margaret started slightly. Oh, no, I was merely... She trailed off, composing herself. It's just that the fireplace has been unused for so long. Beatrice never liked fires in her room. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. And yet we found traces of a burned letter. Margaret clasped her hands together, her fingers
tightening. "Did you?" "We did." Poirot studied her intently. "Tell me, madame, did Beatrice confide in you?" Margaret gave a small, humorless laugh. "Hardly. We were never close. And yet you seem troubled," she exhaled, glancing toward the fireplace once more. "It's only that I never thought Beatrice's fears were real. She spoke of someone watching her, of strange letters. I dismissed it all as paranoia. But now—" She hesitated. If she was right, then someone truly meant to harm her. Poirot watched her with interest. "And do you suspect anyone, madame?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know, but Beatrice did mention something strange a few days ago." "What was that?" Hastings prompted. Margaret hesitated before answering. "She told me that someone had been in her room while she slept." A silence fell over the room. Poirot's gaze flickered toward the bolted windows, the locked door. His fingers drummed lightly against his sleeve. "Most interesting," he murmured. Margaret hesitated only a moment longer before excusing herself, her footsteps fading down. "The corridor." Hastings turned to Poirot. "Well, what do you make of that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Hastings, mon ami, I believe we are closing in on our culprit. Someone was in this room before the murder. Someone who wanted Beatrice to feel afraid." He stepped toward the fireplace, his fingers trailing lightly along the mantel. Then, with the utmost care, he knelt down and examined the grate. A moment later, he reached inside and withdrew something small and charred. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "What is it?" Poirot held up the object for inspection. A single, half-burned matchstick. He smiled. "Tell me, Hastings, why would someone light a fire in a fireplace that was never used?" The answer hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Someone had destroyed something crucial. But what? Poirot slipped the matchstick into his pocket. "Come, mon ami. We have much to uncover." And with that, we left the room, the mystery deepening with every step. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Will. The library of Montclair Estate was a solemn place that morning, the heavy scent of polished mahogany mingling with the crisp autumn air that filtered in through the tall windows. Poirot and I sat across from Horace. Devlin, the Montclair family solicitor, a man of advancing years with thinning silver hair and sharp, hawk-like eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything before him. "I tell you," Devlin was saying, his voice taut with frustration, Miss Montclair was determined to alter her will. She summoned me here not a fortnight ago and gave every indication that she intended to make changes. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. And what, precisely, were these changes to be, monsieur? Devlin hesitated. She did not disclose the details outright. However, she was most insistent that certain provisions needed to be amended. I do know that one of those amendments concerned her stepmother, Mrs. Montclair. Hastings, who had been listening keenly, gave a knowing nod. You mean to say she planned to disinherit her? Devlin sighed. I cannot say for certain. Miss Montclair was very private in legal matters, but she was firm in her decision to alter the document. That is why it is most unsettling that, upon reviewing her papers after her death, the new will is nowhere to be found. Poirot's moustache twitched. And the original will, monsieur? Devlin's lips pressed together in a thin line, still intact. Hastings made a noise of
satisfaction.
Well, there's your answer, Poirot. Margaret Montclair benefits the most from the old will. If Beatrice planned to cut her out, she had every reason to want her dead. Poirot's gaze remained on Devlin. Monsieur, tell me, who knew of this intended revision? Devlin leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses. My clerk was aware that I had been summoned. Mrs. Montclair may have known, as she overheard part of our conversation when I arrived.
Aside from that, I cannot say. But Miss Montclair was not foolish. She confided in someone. If that person still lives, they may hold the key to this puzzle. Poirot inclined his head. A most interesting proposition. Devlin hesitated.
There is one other thing. Poirot motioned for him to continue. After Miss Montclair's death, I conducted a thorough search of her study and bedroom for any sign of the new will. I found nothing, save for one peculiar detail. His voice dropped slightly. The lock on her desk had been tampered with. Hastings straightened. Tampered with? Devlin nodded gravely. The scratches around the keyhole suggest that someone forced it open in haste. It is my belief that the new will was stolen shortly after Miss Montclair's death, perhaps even before the body was discovered. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then we must ask ourselves, mon ami, who had both, the opportunity and the motive? The answer seemed obvious. Hastings turned to Poirot. Margaret Montclair. Poirot merely smiled. Perhaps. Later that afternoon, we found Mrs. Montclair in the drawing-room, seated gracefully by the window, dressed in the deepest mourning. She greeted us with a faint, practised smile, but her eyes remained unreadable. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said, in her smooth, composed voice. I assume you have more questions? Poirot bowed his head. Madame, one must always ask questions, for in them lie the answers. She sighed lightly. Very well. Poirot's gaze flickered to the
mourning band on her wrist. Tell me, madame, were you aware that Mademoiselle Beatrice intended to alter her will?
Margaret's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the armrest. I had heard whispers, but Beatrice was always dramatic in such matters. She made threats, but I never believed she would truly change it. Poirot watched her keenly. And yet the revised will has vanished. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Then perhaps it never existed at all. Hastings let out an incredulous huff. You expect us to believe that? Beatrice's solicitor confirmed her intent to change. Margaret turned to Hastings with the faintest of smiles. Intent is not action, Captain Hastings. Many people consider altering their wills but never follow through. Poirot raised a finger. And yet, madame, if Beatrice had altered it, and someone wished to suppress it, He trailed off, allowing the implication to settle. Margaret's gaze remained steady. That would be quite a bold thing to do. Poirot gave a small, approving nod. Just so. Margaret sighed, glancing toward the fireplace. Inspector Miller has already asked me these questions, Monsieur Poirot, and I told him the truth.
I had no reason to kill Beatrice. The will, as it stands, benefits me. Why would I risk murder if I already stood to inherit? Poirot's brows lifted slightly. A most intriguing defence, and yet, if the new will was less favourable to you—
And if you had knowledge of its contents, then it would be in your best interest to ensure it never saw the light of day. Margaret met his gaze steadily. You forget something, monsieur. The will was locked away. If I had stolen it, how would I have gained access? Poirot inclined his head. An excellent question, madame, one that I intend to answer. That evening, Poirot and I sat in the library, the glow of the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls. Hastings shook his head. I don't trust her, Poirot. She's too composed. Poirot tapped his fingers against his armrest. Perhaps, and yet one must always consider every possibility. Hastings frowned. You mean you don't think she did it? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mon ami, I did not say that. But if she did, she was not alone. Hastings sat up. You believe she had an accomplice? Poirot nodded. Consider this. If Margaret Montclair was aware of the new will, she needed a way to access it. The lock on Beatrice's desk was forced. That suggests someone without a key. Hastings considered this. Someone within the household, then. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Perhaps. At that moment, there was a sharp knock at the door. Inspector Miller entered, his expression grave. We've found something, he said, without preamble. Or rather, someone. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Go on, monsieur. Miller took a deep breath. One of the servants has come forward. Elsie. Carter, the maid. She says she saw someone enter Beatrice's room the night of the murder. A heavy silence filled the air. Hastings gripped the arms of his chair. Who? Miller's eyes darkened. Dr. Lionel Fraser. Poirot did not react. He merely sat back, his fingertips pressed together. Ah, he murmured, the plot, it thickens. And with that, the mystery took another turn. Chapter 8. The Late Night Visitor. The following morning the air was heavy with tension, and the walls of Montclair Estate seemed to close in around us as we gathered once more in the study. Poirot, never one to indulge in the trivialities of the passing hours, had spent the night pondering the latest revelation. The maid, Elsie Carter, had seen someone enter Beatrice's room around midnight. The details were vague, but that was enough to stir the pot of suspicion. Elsie had been summoned to the housekeeper's room to speak with Poirot. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, and she avoided meeting anyone's
eyes. I don't know what to say, sir, she stammered, wringing her apron in her hands. I saw a figure slip past the door. It was late, so late I shouldn't have been about, but I had to fetch a towel for Mrs. Montclair. That's—
When I saw them, Poirot leaned forward in his chair, his gaze intense but patient. You are quite certain, mademoiselle, that it was a person you saw? Elsie nodded quickly. Yes, sir. It was someone tall, wrapped in a cloak, but I couldn't see their face. The hall was dark. I only caught a glimpse before they disappeared.
Inside. Did you hear anything? Any sound that might tell us what happened next? Poirot pressed, his voice soft but insistent. She shook her head, the strain evident in her face. Nothing. Just the sound of the door creaking open like—
They were being careful, then all was quiet. Poirot's gaze flickered briefly toward Hastings before returning to Elsie. "You must understand, mademoiselle, that this information is of great importance. If you saw something, no matter how insignificant it may seem, it could aid us in discovering the truth." Elsie's lip trembled, but she nodded again. "I wish I could be more help. I wish I knew who it was. But I don't." Poirot sat back, his hands folded neatly on the table. He was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You have done well to come forward, mademoiselle. Now go, rest, and do not let your conscience trouble you further." As Elsie left the room, Poirot turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "A shadow in the night, Hastings. A shadow, but no more." I furrowed my brow. "You don't think it was Dr. Fraser, then?" Poirot's eyes twinkled, though his face remained
serious. "Ah, my friend, you see only one possibility, but I assure you there are many." Later that day, Poirot insisted on conducting a careful recreation of the night's events. We stood in the same hallway where Elsie had spotted the mysterious
figure. The mansion seemed strangely still, its rooms hollow with emptiness. Poirot examined every corner, every creak of the floorboards, as though the house itself might give up its secrets. "I am convinced, Hastings, that this was no impulsive act," Poirot remarked, as he paced slowly down the darkened corridor, his voice echoing slightly. "The killer did not act in a flurry of panic. No, mon ami. This was a methodical, deliberate act, carefully planned." I raised an eyebrow. "You think it was someone who knew exactly what they were doing?" "Indeed," Poirot replied, his eyes alight with thought. "Beatrice's room was locked from the inside, as we know. The windows were sealed. It is unlikely that anyone could have escaped unnoticed unless they knew exactly how to get in or out." He paused, studying the door to Beatrice's room. "And yet the poison was administered with care. A very specific type of poison, if my instincts are correct." I glanced toward the door to Beatrice's room, still locked and undisturbed. "Poison? But we know that the champagne glass was clean. There was no trace of poison in it." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, that is where you are mistaken, my dear Hastings. You assume that the poison was introduced through the champagne. But what if the champagne was a decoy? What if the poison was introduced elsewhere?" I blinked, momentarily thrown by the suggestion. "Elsewhere? You mean not in the drink at all?" "Precisely," Poirot said with a slight smile. "You see, the champagne glass was overturned. That much is clear, but it tells us nothing of what happened before Beatrice drank it. Perhaps the poison was administered in a different manner, a subtle method, a method that would be difficult to detect if one did not know what to look for." I nodded, my mind racing. "So what are you suggesting? That someone poisoned her some other way?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "It is possible that the killer used an object, a small item perhaps, a handkerchief or a letter, something that would have come in contact with Beatrice before she took the champagne. A deliberate contact, arranged so that the poison would take effect at the right moment." The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. "A letter? You mean the mysterious half-burned letter we found in the fireplace?" Poirot's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Exactly, Hastings. The letter that Beatrice burned, but not completely. The poison could have been on the letter, or it could have been absorbed into the paper, left behind for Beatrice to handle. A careful placement, a quiet poisoning, done with precision. But why the letter?" I asked, perplexed. Poirot's eyes flashed. "Because, Hastings, a letter is something one expects. It's personal, intimate. The killer knew that Beatrice—" "I would touch it.
And if she were not aware of the danger, if she didn't suspect, then the poison could work its way into her system without raising suspicion.
I felt a shiver run down my spine. But who would have had access to the letter? Poirot's gaze swept over the hallway once more. The question, mon ami, is not who had access to the letter, but who had access to Beatrice's personal
Life. Who could have been in a position to create such a trap? As if on cue, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching.
It was Margaret Montclair, her presence as composed as ever, though there was a sharpness to her step today. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly, "is there some progress to report?" Poirot gave her a long, scrutinizing look, as though weighing her very soul. "Progress, madame, is an elusive thing. But I am convinced that someone in this house knows more than they are willing to admit." Margaret's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. "I am certain that whoever did this will
Be found. My stepdaughter deserves justice.
Her voice was a model of grace, but something in the back of my mind told me that there was more to her calm demeanour than she let on. Poirot inclined his head. "Of that, madame, I have no doubt." The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken tension. Margaret stepped away, her gaze lingering a fraction too long on the door to Beatrice's room. Poirot's eyes followed her, but he said nothing. "What now, Poirot?" I asked, the weight of the investigation pressing down on me. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Now, Hastings, we watch, we listen, and we wait for the final piece to fall into place." The storm was brewing, and with each passing moment, the truth seemed ever closer, yet ever more elusive. Chapter 9. A second attempt at murder. The day was overcast, a blanket of grey clouds hanging heavily over Montclair estate. A faint drizzle had begun to fall, its rhythmic tapping on the windows providing an odd sense of calm amidst the gathering storm of intrigue that had consumed the house. I was standing in the study, reviewing my notes from the previous days, when Poirot entered, his expression as composed as ever. "It is time, mon ami," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "The case grows clearer, but there are still loose threads we must tie." I glanced up from my papers, a faint frown tugging at my brow. "Is there something you've discovered, Poirot?" "Perhaps," he replied cryptically, his eyes glinting with a certain intensity. "But before we rush ahead with our conclusions, we must first observe carefully. There is an event this afternoon that I believe may provide us with new insights." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not quite understanding. "What event is that?" Poirot paused, his gaze drifting toward the window, where, in the distance, I could make out the shape of a car parked near the front entrance. "It is a most curious development," he said softly. "Reginald Blake, he will be driving today. A test of sorts, if you will." I could see the faintest trace of an enigmatic smile on Poirot's lips. "A test?" I repeated, baffled. Poirot didn't elaborate, instead turning to me with a sharp look. "Come, Hastings, we must watch." We moved to the large drawing-room, the windows offering a clear view of the estate's long driveway. The distant hum of an engine reached our ears before the car itself appeared, driven by none other than Reginald Blake. He was alone in the vehicle, his posture relaxed, as he steered the car towards the estate's entrance. I watched Poirot closely, his eyes following the car with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I felt an unsettling sense of foreboding as Reggie's car disappeared around the corner, heading toward the long stretch of gravel road that led
out of the estate.
It wasn't long before Poirot gave a single, sharp nod, and we both moved swiftly toward the door. Moments later, We stood outside in the cool air, waiting. I had just started to ask Poirot why he had brought me out here when a sudden, deafening,
screeching noise cut through the quiet. The sound was followed by a loud crash, and my heart leapt in my chest as I turned toward the road.
There, at the far end of the driveway, Reggie's car had swerved wildly, nearly crashing into the stone wall before careening to a stop. The vehicle sat still, a few yards from the stone barrier, its front wheels locked in an unnatural angle. Reginald Blake's limp figure hung loosely from the driver's side window, his head lolling unnaturally to one side. Without hesitation, Poirot broke into a run, his small but quick strides carrying him toward the scene with remarkable speed. I followed closely, my mind racing with questions. When we reached the car, Poirot immediately leaned over and checked Reggie's pulse. I stood by, watching the unconscious man with concern. Poirot looked up, his expression grave. "He lives," he declared, though his tone was somber. "But it was no accident, Hastings. This was deliberate." I could barely conceal my shock. "Deliberate? Are you suggesting someone tampered with his brakes?" Poirot's eyes narrowed as he examined the car's undercarriage. "It would appear so. The brake lines have been severed, deliberately cut. Whoever did this wanted to ensure that the car would fail at precisely the right moment." He straightened, turning to face me with a sharp look. "And now, Hastings, we must ask ourselves why. What does this have to do with Beatrice's death?" Pieces were starting to fit together in my mind. It wasn't just a simple act of sabotage. This was an escalation. Beatrice's murder had been carefully orchestrated, and now someone was making another attempt, this time on Reggie Blake. It was clear that the killer was growing desperate. Poirot turned to the driver, pulling a note from his pocket. "We will need to speak with the staff. Someone here must know who would have had access to the car." His voice was firm, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully on the wrecked vehicle. "We'll need to act fast, Poirot. Someone's trying to cover their tracks, and this time they may have come closer to succeeding," I said, feeling a sense of urgency I hadn't yet experienced in the case. Poirot's face remained calm, but I saw the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Indeed, Hastings, but the more they try to cover their tracks, the more they reveal themselves. We are closer than ever to the truth." We returned to the estate, where the staff had gathered, visibly shaken by the events that had unfolded. They looked at each other uneasily, none of them able to offer much in the way of explanations. But Poirot was undeterred. Elsie Carter, the maid, was standing near the back, her eyes downcast. When she saw Poirot approach, she visibly tensed. "Ah, mademoiselle?" Poirot said, his voice calm but steady. "It seems the shadow of danger grows ever larger. You must understand that we are all at risk here. You saw the figure entering Beatrice's room that night. Now tell me, what more did you see?" Elsie hesitated for a long moment, her lips trembling as she looked around the room. "I didn't see much more, sir. Just that figure. But it was strange, the way they moved. They seemed in such a hurry, as though they knew something was going to happen. I thought they might be in trouble themselves." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And yet they weren't in trouble, were they?" "No, mademoiselle. They were the ones who created the danger, the ones who plotted it all." Elsie opened her mouth to speak, but faltered, clearly frightened. Poirot's voice softened. "Do not fear, mademoiselle. This will be resolved, but you must help us." I could see that Elsie was battling with her own uncertainty. She knew something, but she was afraid to say it. It was only when Poirot leaned in, his gaze almost hypnotic, that she finally spoke. I I don't know much, but I overheard something.
Last night? After dinner? Mr. Blake, he was arguing with Mr. Devlin about something. I couldn't hear all of it, but they were speaking about a document. Something important. I think Mr. Blake was worried about it. Poirot's expression
Didn't change, but I could sense the shift in his mind. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place. A document, he repeated quietly, as if to himself. A missing will, perhaps? Something that would give Mr. Blake a claim to Beatrice's inheritance? I felt a flicker of recognition. Could it be? Had Reggie's desperation to secure his future led him to sabotage his own life? Was this more than a failed murder attempt? Poirot stood up straighter, his eyes glinting with a renewed purpose. Yes, Hastings, the killer grows bolder, but their mistakes, those they will prove their undoing. As we left the staff room, Poirot's mind was already turning over new possibilities. We weren't just looking for a murderer anymore. We were chasing someone who was willing to kill, not only for money, but for power, for control over a legacy. And I knew one thing for certain. The killer would not stop until they had what they wanted. Chapter 10. The Hidden Truth in the Ashes. The days following Reggie Blake's near-fatal accident had only deepened the mystery surrounding Beatrice Montclair's death. As we returned to Montclair Estate after the unsettling incident, the atmosphere within the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Everyone was on edge, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken words. It was as if a dark cloud hovered over the estate, one that only Poirot could see for what it was, a veil of deceit that hid the truth from all but those willing to look beyond the obvious. Poirot was no longer satisfied with simply questioning the family and staff. He knew there was something more to this case, something that had been hidden in plain sight. And now, as I sat with him in his study, my mind racing over the events of the past few days, he turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye, as though the final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. "It is time, mon ami," he said, his voice laced with quiet excitement. "I believe we have overlooked something very important. We must return to Beatrice's room and inspect. The ashes in the fireplace." I blinked, surprised. "The ashes? But Poirot, we've examined everything in that room. Surely there can't be anything left to find." Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "Ah, Hastings, it is the details that often escape us. What is important is not the obvious, but the seemingly inconsequential. Let us return to the scene." We made our way back to the room where Beatrice had met her untimely death, the same room where the locked door and bolted windows had defied explanation. There, in front of the cold, soot-streaked fireplace, Poirot knelt down, his eyes scanning the ashes with careful precision. "You see, mon ami," Poirot murmured, as I stood behind him, watching his every movement. "There is a particular pattern to how the papers were burned. Whoever did this was in a hurry, yes, but they did not wish to destroy everything. They wanted us to find something." I watched as Poirot gently sifted through the ashes, his fingers moving with the delicacy
of a seasoned detective.
His movements were meticulous, as though he could feel the hidden truth buried beneath the charred remains. It was clear that this wasn't just a random fire. Poirot was certain there was something deliberately concealed here. After a moment, his fingers paused, and he carefully pulled out a fragment of burned paper. His eyes lit up with triumph, and I could feel my heart quicken as I stepped closer. "Ah," he said softly. "You see, Hastings, a name. It is almost complete." Poirot turned the charred fragment over and studied it intently. "Here, The letters are faint, but they are still legible. He held it up to the light, and I leaned in closer, squinting at the barely discernible markings. I could make out a few letters. L and Y, that was it. It wasn't much, but Poirot seemed satisfied. "You see, mon ami," Poirot said with a satisfied smile. "It is the key to the mystery. The name is Lucy Harrington." I furrowed my brow. Lucy Harrington? The name was unfamiliar, and I had never heard it mentioned in the context of the case. "But Poirot, there is no Lucy in the household. I've spoken with everyone, and no one seems to know anyone by that name." Poirot, however, was unshaken. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he looked up at me. "Ah, but this is where you are mistaken, Hastings. Lucy Harrington may not be in the household, but she is connected to it in a way you have not yet considered." I stood still for a moment, trying to process the revelation. I could see that Poirot was on the verge of something important, but the details were still too sparse for me to grasp. "But Poirot, who is Lucy Harrington, and how does she tie into all of this?" Poirot's gaze softened as he looked at me, almost as if he were sharing a secret. "That, mon ami, is the question we must answer. But I believe that the answers lie within the past. We must investigate further." As we left the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Lucy Harrington was a name I had never heard, and yet it seemed to be the key to unlocking the entire mystery. But who was she? And why had Beatrice hidden her name in such a way? Poirot's mind was already working at full speed, his thoughts racing as he mulled over the possibilities. I could see him mentally retracing every step, every conversation, and every clue that had led us to this point. It was clear that the investigation was far from over, and the truth was still eluding us. As we entered the main hall, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The tension in the house was palpable, and it seemed as though every step we took brought us closer to the truth and to the murderer. Poirot turned to me, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "Hastings, we must find Lucy Harrington. She holds the answers we seek, and I believe she is closer to this case than anyone realizes." I nodded, though I was still uncertain about how to proceed, but Poirot was resolute. He had never been wrong before, and I trusted his instincts completely. If he believed that Lucy Harrington was the key to solving Beatrice's murder, then I had no doubt that she was. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the final image remained elusive, hidden just beyond our reach. Poirot's confidence was reassuring, but I could feel the tension mounting as the hours passed. We had come so far, and yet the truth still lay just out of reach. "Do you know where we can find her?" I asked, my voice tight with anticipation. Poirot gave a small, enigmatic smile. "I do not know yet, but we will find her, Hastings. The name is familiar to me. It is only a matter of time before we uncover her connection to this case." As the evening drew near, I could sense that the investigation was nearing its climax. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and I knew that Poirot was on the verge of a breakthrough. But with every revelation, new questions arose, and the stakes grew higher. Who was Lucy Harrington? And what role did she play in Beatrice's death? I had no answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The truth was close, and once Poirot had unravelled the final threads, the murderer would have nowhere to hide. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. The atmosphere in the drawing-room had grown heavy with tension, as Poirot, with his usual methodical precision, called all the primary players to gather. I watched them enter one by one, each wearing a mask of strained composure, as if they were aware that the noose was tightening, but still too frightened to show it. Margaret Montclair walked in first, her shoulders stiff, her face pale but composed. Behind her, Dr. Lionel Fraser entered, his expression unreadable, his eyes flickering nervously as they settled on the group. Reggie Blake followed, looking far too relaxed for someone who had been nearly killed in an accident only days before. Finally, Horace Devlin, Beatrice's lawyer, stepped in, his gait slow and deliberate, his eyes sharp as he scanned the room, perhaps wary of the direction the investigation was taking. Poirot remained standing at the centre of the room, his arms folded neatly across his chest, an air of quiet command emanating from him. He did not smile, but I could see the sharp glint in his eyes as he surveyed the group. I took my place by his side, watching the proceedings with as much interest as I could muster. This was the moment of reckoning, the point where the carefully constructed web of lies and half-truths would either unravel or hold firm. "Ah, my friends," Poirot began in his soft, unhurried French accent, his gaze sweeping over the group. "We
are gathered today to make sense of the mystery that surrounds us. Beatrice Montclair is dead, and it is clear that foul play was at work. But the question remains, who amongst you is responsible?" There was a collective shift in the room, an
almost imperceptible tightening of postures, as if they had all been waiting for him to make his move. Poirot was not one to leave things to chance, however. He knew that the truth would come only when they were pushed to reveal it, each under pressure in their own way. "I think," Poirot continued, "that we must first address the matter of Beatrice's will. It seems, from what I have learned, that Miss Montclair was on the verge of making a change, perhaps to her own benefit, or perhaps not. Mr. Devlin, you mentioned this to me before, yes? That she was thinking of altering it. But where is this new document? What happened to it?" Devlin shifted in his seat, but quickly regained his composure. "I told you everything I know, Poirot. Beatrice was indeed considering making changes, but she had not yet put anything in writing. If she had, it was not with me." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Indeed," he murmured, his lips curling slightly. "But it seems to me that you are withholding something, Mr. Devlin. Perhaps you have more knowledge of this than you let on." A flash of irritation crossed Devlin's face, but he quickly suppressed it. "I've told you all I know, that's the truth." Poirot seemed satisfied with the response, or, more likely, with the lack of one. He moved on, allowing his next target to stew in the silence. His eyes shifted to Margaret, who was now standing with her back straight, her arms folded as though she were bracing herself for something unpleasant. "Madame Montclair," Poirot said, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of sharpness. "I noticed you were quite tight-lipped when we spoke of your first marriage. May I ask why?" Margaret's lips tightened, and for a brief moment I thought she might snap, but she merely adjusted her posture, her gaze unwavering. "My first marriage is of no consequence to anyone here, and I see no reason to discuss it further." Poirot nodded slowly, but there was something in his expression that told me he was not satisfied. "Perhaps, but the past, madame, it has a way of coming back, and those who attempt to bury it often find that it is not so easily hidden." Margaret gave a small dry laugh, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not in the business of hiding anything, Poirot. I merely don't see why it's relevant." Poirot's lips twitched into a slight smile, but he said nothing more on the matter. Instead, he shifted his gaze to Dr. Lionel Fraser, who had been unusually quiet, a fact that Poirot had no doubt noted. "Dr. Fraser," Poirot began, his voice gentle, but with a discernible edge. "You have been most reticent, I must say. Is it that you have something to hide, or is it simply the weight of Beatrice's death that has left you speechless?" Dr. Fraser's eyes flickered nervously before he cleared his throat. "I have nothing to hide, Poirot. I'm simply tired." "This has been a difficult time for all of us." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his expression one of polite skepticism. "Ah, yes, I imagine it has been. But I must ask, Dr. Fraser, did you by chance visit Beatrice's room on the night of her death?" The doctor's face hardened, though he quickly regained his composure. "I did, but only briefly. She had asked to see me earlier in the day, and I went to check on her. There was nothing unusual about it. She seemed anxious, but nothing more." "Nothing more?" Poirot's tone was quietly insistent. "Was there something else she said, something that perhaps you haven't mentioned?" Dr. Fraser's lips tightened. "She was frightened. She thought she was being watched. I did my best to reassure her, but it was clear that something was troubling her." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "And yet, you said nothing of this before? How curious." Dr. Fraser seemed about to speak, but Poirot held up a hand, stopping him before he could. "No matter, I suppose. We all have our secrets, don't we?" Poirot allowed the room to simmer in a moment of silence before he turned his attention to Reggie Blake, who had been watching the exchange with mild interest. "And you, Mr. Blake? You have been remarkably calm throughout this entire ordeal. Not once have I seen you in a state of distress, despite your close relation to Miss Montclair. Could it be that you are unaffected because you have nothing to lose?" Reggie's grin widened, his posture shifting to a more casual, almost careless stance. "I've nothing to hide, Poirot. Beatrice and I were cousins, yes, but we weren't
exactly close. As for the will, it's hardly something that concerns me. I stand to inherit nothing." Poirot nodded slowly.
"Ah, but that is where you are wrong, Mr. Blake. You stand to inherit something very valuable indeed, a secret. It is a secret that I suspect someone very close to you would prefer to keep buried." Reggie's smile faltered for just a moment, and Poirot's gaze never left him. The tension in the room thickened. Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The poison that killed Beatrice. It was not a simple act of chance. It was administered deliberately, with great care. The poison was chosen with precision, the method of delivery equally so. And yet, none of you seem to have noticed. But I know, mon ami, I know." He paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. It was clear that Poirot was withholding something, a piece of the puzzle that he was not yet ready to reveal. His eyes flicked from one suspect to another, each one trying their best to mask their growing unease. "I will reveal more soon, my friends," Poirot said with a small, enigmatic smile. "But for now, I must ask you all to think carefully. Someone here knows more than they are saying, and it will not be long before they reveal themselves." The room was deathly silent. Every person present seemed to shrink under Poirot's unrelenting gaze. I knew that he was closing in on the truth, and that soon the person who had dared to take Beatrice's life would have nowhere to hide. But as I glanced around the room, I realized something else. One of them was lying. Of that I was sure. And when the truth came to light, it would shake them all to the core. Chapter 12. The Poison That Wasn't in the Glass. The drawing-room had grown quiet after Poirot's last words, the air thick with uncertainty and the weight of suspicion. Each suspect shifted slightly, eyes darting toward one another, unsure of where Poirot's next deduction would lead. I, too, felt the sense of anticipation pressing on me. I could tell Poirot was on the verge of something significant. There was a slight shift in his demeanour, the way he studied each individual as if calculating their every move, every glance. We were gathered together in the same room where Poirot had earlier turned the investigation into a subtle dance of interrogations, carefully probing each of them for any crack in their composure. And now, with a final flourish, Poirot was closing in on his solution. "I have made a small discovery," Poirot finally said, breaking the tense silence, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "It concerns the method of Beatrice's murder." I could feel the collective breath in the room catch as everyone turned toward him. It was the moment we had all been waiting for, and yet no one dared to speak. Poirot, ever the maestro, allowed the silence to stretch out, enjoying the anticipation. "You see," he continued, his gaze now flicking to the vanity table in the corner of the room, "I was struck by one small detail earlier today. A detail so easily overlooked, but one that holds the key to understanding how Beatrice met her end." I watched Poirot move toward the vanity with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes fixed on the objects before him. He reached for the small perfume bottle, its elegant shape delicate in his hands. The bottle, like everything else in the room, seemed innocent enough, its clear liquid reflecting the light from the nearby lamp. Yet something in Poirot's expression told me that this simple object was anything but benign. "Perfume," Poirot murmured, inspecting the bottle carefully. "A fragrance is often an intimate thing, a woman's personal touch. It is not something that would readily raise suspicion." He opened the bottle carefully, the scent wafting gently into the air. It was faint, floral, but not overpowering. He paused for a moment, allowing the aroma to fill the space around us. Then, with a look of intense concentration, Poirot turned the bottle slightly, as if searching for something unseen. "I asked myself," Poirot said, almost as if speaking to himself,
How is it that Beatrice came to be poisoned without touching the glass of champagne?
After all, it was clear that the glass contained no trace of the poison. The champagne was untouched, no signs of bitterness or discoloration. I nodded, recalling the initial examination of the scene where it had been confirmed that Beatrice had not drunk from the glass. Her death had been ruled as a result of poisoning, but there had been no obvious entry point, no sign of the poison in the beverage she had been holding. It had been a puzzle that had bothered Poirot from the beginning. "Ah, my friends," Poirot said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of triumph. "You see, Beatrice did not ingest the poison through her mouth. No, the poison was absorbed through her skin. The perfume bottle, this perfume bottle, was the
means of delivery." He uncapped the bottle again and allowed the remaining liquid inside to settle for a moment before turning back to the others,
his eyes now gleaming with certainty. "I have tested the remaining liquid," Poirot said, "and it is laced with a troppa belladonna, deadly nightshade." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. A troppa belladonna, the very name sent a chill through the room. Known for its toxic properties, it was a poison that had been used throughout history for its deadly effects, causing paralysis, delirium, and eventually death. But how had it ended up in Beatrice's perfume bottle? "I imagine you all know the significance of what I say," Poirot continued. "This poison was carefully introduced into the perfume, likely just before Beatrice applied it. There would have been no suspicion, no reason to think that something so innocuous could be
so deadly.
And so the poison did its work, slowly, imperceptibly, as Beatrice absorbed it through her skin. Hastings, who had been watching Poirot with an air of cautious curiosity, now looked baffled. But Poirot, how could they have done it? Surely, it's not easy to get access to someone's perfume like that. It's too personal, too intimate. Could anyone have managed it? Poirot's lips curled into a smile, though there was no humour in it. Ah, that is the question, mon ami. Who had the opportunity? Who had the access to Beatrice's vanity, to the very things she held most dear? He paused, his eyes scanning the group once more. There was a faint shift in the room, a moment of realization dawning on the faces around him. I could see it too, pieces clicking into place. The answer, Poirot said, his voice steady but filled with quiet certainty, lies with the one who had the most reason to keep Beatrice quiet, the one who knew her habits well enough to understand that she would never suspect anything out of the ordinary, the one who, perhaps, had a personal connection to her perfume. His gaze settled on Margaret Montclair. The room seemed to grow colder, and I saw the briefest flicker of unease in Margaret's eyes before she regained her composure. "Margaret," Poirot said softly, "you are the one who introduced Beatrice to this particular perfume, are you not?" Margaret's face paled, though she quickly masked the reaction. "What are you suggesting, Poirot? I simply gave her a gift. She wore it often." Poirot's eyes remained fixed on her, unwavering. "Yes, but that was years ago, n'est-ce pas? And yet you still knew the exact perfume she wore. The access to her vanity was yours, surely." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Poirot held up a hand, silencing her. "I have no need for further denials," Poirot said, his voice now a quiet command. "You gave Beatrice that perfume, and you knew exactly how to poison it, knowing she would trust it. There was no other way for the poison to enter her system unnoticed. And once she absorbed it, it would take time. Time that would allow you to act, to hide your tracks." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Her expression shifted, and in that stillness it became clear that Poirot's deductions had struck home. I saw a slight tremor in her hand, the faintest sign of guilt betraying her. Then, with a heavy sigh, she spoke, her voice tight. "Yes," Margaret admitted, her words barely above a whisper. "I did it. I poisoned her. I never meant for it to happen this way, but I had no choice. She was going to change the will, and she had threatened to expose me, my past, my first marriage, the things I did to escape it." "She knew too much," Poirot nodded, his gaze steady but never unkind. "It was the only way, you thought. And yet, you did not count on one thing, Madame Montclair. You did not count on me." Margaret looked down, tears beginning to glisten in her eyes, but she made no attempt to stop them. For the first time, I could see the full weight of her guilt settle upon her, and with it, the realization that the game was over. Poirot's eyes softened, but only slightly. "You thought you could silence Beatrice, but the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, and now, Madame, you will answer for what you have done." The room fell silent once more, the finality of Poirot's words settling over us like a heavy cloak. The mystery, it seemed, had been solved. But as I looked at Margaret, broken and defeated, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets lurking in the shadows, just waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 13. Poirot sets the trap. Poirot stood with a quiet, almost imperceptible satisfaction, watching as Margaret Montclair's expression shifted from shock to horror, and then, just as swiftly, to a forced composure. It was clear that something had broken in her carefully constructed facade. Something had snapped, She had thought herself to be the only one who knew the true nature of her actions, yet now Poirot had made it clear that the game was not over. "Madame."
"Montclair," Poirot said, his voice silky with an air of finality. "You were so sure of your secret. But what if, just perhaps, the truth was not as hidden as you believed?" His eyes glinted, and I saw that familiar gleam of triumph that marked
his most intricate deductions. Margaret's hand, which had been gripping the arm of her chair, went limp. She met Poirot's gaze, her face pale, her lips trembling slightly. I don't know what you mean, Poirot. There is no more to uncover." "Ah, but that is where you are wrong," Poirot said, stepping forward. "You see, I have found it, the missing will, the document that would change everything. Beatrice's final testament, the one she was so eager to rewrite. It is in my hands now, Madame Montclair." His words dripped with an almost theatrical certainty. For a moment, there was only silence in the room. Margaret's eyes widened, and she took an involuntary step backward, her breath quickening. But Poirot was not finished. He turned his attention to Dr. Lionel Fraser, who had been standing by the fireplace with his usual unreadable expression. "You, Doctor," Poirot continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You too had a part to play, did you not? You were present at that fateful moment. You were, after all, her trusted physician, and yet Fraser's demeanour faltered for the briefest of moments. He shifted his weight, and his hand involuntarily twitched toward his pocket. It was barely noticeable, but Poirot saw it, an instinctive gesture that confirmed his suspicions. The doctor's gaze darted toward the study, where Poirot had placed the empty folder with the title "Last Will" scrawled across it in hastily written ink. The reaction was telling. "I trust, Doctor, that you were aware of Beatrice's plans to change the will." Poirot's voice remained even, but there was a sharpness to it now, like a trap closing. Fraser's lips parted, but he was quick to regain control of himself. "I—" he began, but Poirot raised a hand, signalling for him to stop. "Not yet, mon ami," Poirot said with a small, enigmatic smile. "I have asked you not to speak yet, not until we see who cracks under the weight of this information." Hastings, who had been standing nearby, looked confused as he glanced between Poirot, Margaret, and Fraser. "I'm afraid I don't quite understand," he admitted. "What is this about a missing will? Poirot, what are you trying to tell us?" Poirot turned to his old friend, his face momentarily softening. "Ah, Hastings, you are ever the optimist. It is simple, really. We know, or rather we strongly suspect, that Beatrice was preparing to alter her will before her untimely death. The will she was so eager to amend would have changed the course of many lives. But, as we have seen, the document has mysteriously
vanished. He paused for effect, then added, "It is not truly gone, though."
"Not lost. I have it, mon ami." Hastings's eyes widened. "Poirot, you found it?" "But how—" Poirot raised a hand to silence him gently. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, allow me to explain. You see, I have not yet found it." "Not in the literal sense?" "No." His gaze flickered to the study once more, and I followed his line of sight. There, on the desk, where no one had dared to look before, lay a small, leather-bound folder, innocuous, yet strangely out of place. Poirot smiled softly. "But I know where it is hidden, and I know who will panic when the news reaches them." It was then that Margaret's composure finally cracked. She looked away from Poirot's unyielding gaze, her eyes darting to the door, as if she were calculating an escape route. But there was no escape. Her shoulders slumped as she seemed to grasped the futility of further evasion. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice breaking as she spoke, the facade of indifference now gone. Poirot's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "I want the truth, Madame Montclair, the truth about why you felt the need to silence Beatrice, why you believed her last will could not be allowed to come to light." He let his words hang in the air, knowing full well the pressure they exerted. Margaret was silent for a long moment, as though weighing her options. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted to delay things, to buy time. She had threatened to expose me, you see. My first marriage, it was a mistake, a life I had to leave behind." "But Beatrice knew. She knew everything." Poirot nodded, his face impassive. "So you resorted to the most drastic of measures, the perfume, the poison." He was quick to see the connections now, the motive, the method, the opportunity. "You thought that if she were dead, her will would remain unchanged. You would be safe." Margaret's face crumpled, the weight of her actions finally sinking in.
"I never meant for it to end like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "I thought I could stop her. I thought it would be just one little push, and she'd stay silent forever." Poirot's gaze softened, though there was no mistaking the severity of his words.
"Your actions, madame, led to her death. And now you will face the consequences." But just as I thought the scene would wind down, Poirot paused. He glanced at the door, a quiet tension creeping back into his face. "But there is more, Hastings," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "More that we have yet to uncover." I looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean, Poirot?" Poirot gave a small, cryptic smile, his eyes still fixed on Margaret, who was now visibly trembling. The will was not the only thing Beatrice held over the others. There is still one more question, one more key that will unlock the entire mystery. And when that is revealed, all will become clear. I turned to follow his gaze, but I couldn't see what he saw. Poirot's mind was always 10 steps ahead, and I had a sense that though we had taken a great leap forward, the final piece of the puzzle was still just out of reach. Chapter 14. The grand unmasking. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension, so palpable it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every face in the room, save for Poirot's, was strung tight with anxiety, their eyes flickering between each other as if waiting for the hammer to fall. Even Margaret Montclair, who had been so composed before, now looked uncharacteristically on edge. The final piece of the puzzle was about to be laid bare, and none of them could escape the consequences of what was to come. Poirot, ever the picture of calm, stood in the center of the room, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He was watching each person closely, his sharp eyes taking in the smallest of details, an instinctive glance here, a subtle shift in posture there. He had called everyone together, knowing that the moment of revelation had arrived. Now, Mesty.
"Amice," Poirot began, his voice a cool, deliberate whisper that seemed to echo through the room. "The truth, at last, shall be made clear. All the pieces that have been scattered through this tangled web of deception will come together."
Margaret's lips tightened, and she crossed her arms defensively, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on Poirot as if she were bracing herself for the inevitable. Beside her, Dr. Lionel Fraser shifted nervously, his fingers tapping a slight rhythm against his trousers. The rest of the gathered group, the few who had not yet been directly implicated, remained quiet, their attention rapt. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, and he paused, letting the weight of his words settle before he continued. "I have observed the inconsistencies in your stories, the subtle clues you all left behind, but one thread of truth kept unraveling, drawing me closer to the heart of the mystery." He turned his eyes on Margaret Montclair, who looked almost predatory in her silence. "It is not simply that you wish to stop Beatrice from rewriting her will, Madame Montclair," he said slowly, his voice a smooth caress. "No, it goes much deeper than that. You had a motive, yes, but also a fear that Beatrice would expose your secret, a secret you have carried for so long." Margaret stiffened at the mention of her secret. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the briefest of moments, the walls she had so carefully erected around herself seemed to crack. Poirot's eyes gleamed with knowing. "The truth is that Lucy Harrington does not exist, does she, Madame Montclair? That name, it was an invention. A mask you created to bury your past." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and Poirot did not miss the subtle tension in her posture as she struggled to keep her composure. For all her calculated silence, it was clear she had been cornered. "You were once Lucy Harrington," Poirot continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The woman who was married to a man that met with a tragic, untimely end. The very same woman who, when faced with a threat to her carefully constructed life, chose the path of murder to ensure her secret stayed hidden." Margaret's face went ashen. For a moment she looked as though the weight of her past might crush her entirely. But her resolve seemed to steel itself in the next breath. She looked up at Poirot, her gaze defiant, though her voice trembled.
"I had no choice," she said, her voice hoarse. "Beatrice was going to destroy everything I had worked so hard for."
My past, my future. She was threatening it all. I had to stop her. Poirot's face softened for a moment, a flicker of understanding passing across his features. "And so you poisoned her," he said, almost kindly. "You did not act in a rash
frenzy, as some would do. No, you planned it with methodical care, using her vanity bottle, her perfume, to deliver the poison. A slow, insidious death." Margaret's breath hitched, and she took a half-step back, but Poirot pressed on, his tone unwavering.
"When Beatrice became suspicious," he continued, "you knew that the only way to prevent her from revealing your secret was to destroy the new will. You could not risk it, could not allow her to leave her estate to anyone else. So you took the will and you burned it, just as you destroyed all the evidence of your first marriage. And yet, you failed to account for one crucial detail: the perfume itself." Margaret's hand flew to her throat as though she had been struck physically. Her voice faltered. I didn't mean for it to end this way. It was supposed to be a quiet death, something no one would question." Poirot stepped closer, his face stern now, the detective in him fully awakened. "But it was not quiet, Madame Montclair, was it? You see, there was one small detail you failed to consider. While you carefully poisoned Beatrice, you also contaminated yourself in the process. The perfume you used, Beatrice's perfume, had traces of belladonna, did it not?" Margaret's hand dropped from her throat, and she seemed to shrink in on herself. She knew it was coming. The truth was undeniable now, laid bare for all to see. Poirot's eyes did not leave hers. "You applied the perfume to yourself unknowingly, absorbing the same poison you had carefully planned to use on Beatrice. And in doing so, you sealed your own fate." The traces of belladonna found in your perfume bottle were not a mistake, Madame Montclair. They were the final proof of your guilt." A tense silence followed Poirot's words. It hung in the air like a weight, thick and suffocating. The others in the room stood motionless, unable to tear their gaze away from Margaret, whose face was now a mask of guilt and resignation. Poirot glanced around the room, noting the varying expressions of shock, disbelief, and suspicion that had crossed each of the gathered faces. But his eyes never left Margaret. He knew she was the one who had orchestrated everything. She was the key. "You believed yourself clever, madam," Poirot said, his voice almost a whisper now. "But it is not enough to outwit others. One must always be aware of the risks one takes in the pursuit of deception. You made one fatal error." Margaret's shoulders sagged. Her pride had been shattered, her secrets exposed for all to see. There was nothing left to say. Poirot's voice broke the silence once more, though now it carried an air of finality. "The game is over, Madame Montclair. The truth is out. You killed Beatrice to protect yourself, and in the end, your own carelessness has led to your undoing." As the reality of what had just been revealed settled over the room, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had gripped us for so long was finally breaking apart, as though a dam had been released and the flood of truth had washed away the mystery. Margaret Montclair had been the one to pull the strings from the very beginning. She had been the architect of the death of her cousin, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. Poirot gave a final, knowing look at the others in the room before turning to leave. "There is nothing more to be done. The matter is in the hands of the law now," and with that, the case of Beatrice's death was finally closed. Chapter 15. The Denouement. "Order and method, Hastings!" The quiet murmur of voices had faded into an eerie silence as Poirot stood in front of Margaret Montclair, his back straight, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. The revelation had come swiftly, like a well-placed chess move. The killer had been unmasked, and the game was over. Yet, even now, the tension lingered in the room like an unspoken question hanging in the air. Margaret Montclair had barely spoken a word since Poirot's unflinching exposé. She sat now, her posture stiff, her eyes staring into the fire as if it could consume the truth and make everything vanish. The rest of the room, however, seemed locked in a kind of stunned disbelief. Dr. Fraser, normally so composed, was sweating profusely. Elsie Carter's hands were trembling, and Reggie Blake stared ahead, mouth agape, as though trying to make sense of what had just happened. Poirot turned his attention to the gathered company, noting their expressions with his usual, unhurried precision. With a deliberate gesture, he indicated that they all gather around the table. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Mes amis," he began, the French term rolling smoothly from his tongue. "I will now explain the solution to this matter step by step, as we say in my country, order and method. You may have your doubts, but I assure you all will be made clear." He paused for a moment, watching as Margaret flinched ever so slightly at his words. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and though there was still a trace of defiance in her gaze, it was the defiance of a woman cornered, not a confident killer. Poirot took a deep breath. "The first question you must ask yourself," he said, "is who had the most to gain from Beatrice Montclair's death?" The answer was clear from the beginning. It was you, Madame Montclair. "But why?" He glanced around the room, ensuring his audience was hanging on to his every word. The missing will was a vital piece of the puzzle. Beatrice had been on the verge of changing it, altering the distribution of her wealth, most likely cutting you out or at least reducing your share. As a woman who had built her life on the fortune she inherited from her first marriage, you could not allow that to happen. Margaret's lips tightened as Poirot continued. She had expected him to speak about greed, but now her eyes were betraying a flicker of something more, a recognition that Poirot's mind was far sharper than she had anticipated. The method
of murder, Poirot went on, was more subtle than you perhaps intended. You used Beatrice's perfume, a gift, something she trusted, something she applied daily. It was an act that seemed perfectly innocent, even loving. The poison, a deadly
dose of belladonna absorbed through her skin. It was a slow and insidious death, just as you had planned. Poirot's voice remained even, but there was a sharpness to his words now, as if each syllable were being cut with a scalpel. And then, when Beatrice grew suspicious of the change in her condition, when she realized that something was wrong, you took the only step you could. You stole the new will and destroyed it. It was the last safety net that Beatrice had against your machinations, and once it was gone, you were free to claim your victory. A heavy silence followed Poirot's words. Margaret's face was still, but her eyes were wide with something bordering on panic. She had expected the deductions, but not so many of them to come so quickly, and certainly not with such detail. Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white, as she finally broke her silence. "You don't understand?" she said, her voice cold but trembling at the edges. "I didn't have a choice. Beatrice was a fool. She couldn't see what I had to do to protect myself, to keep my life from falling apart again. She was going to ruin everything, my past, my future, everything I had worked for. She was a threat, and I had to eliminate that threat." Poirot's expression softened slightly, but there was no pity in his eyes. "You were clever, Madame Montclair," he said, "but not as clever as Hercule Poirot." The words seemed to settle like a weight in the room. Margaret stared at Poirot for a moment, her breath shallow, before she lowered her eyes. There was no denying
it now. The truth was inescapable. "You are under arrest, Madame Montclair," Inspector Carter said, his voice firm. He had been standing quietly off to the side, observing the exchange, but now he stepped forward, placing a hand on Margaret's arm.
"For the murder of Beatrice Montclair and the destruction of her will." Margaret did not resist as Carter guided her out of the room, her shoulders slumped in resignation. Her fate had been sealed, and there was nothing more to be done. Poirot watched her go, his face a study of calm, his thoughts already turning inward. "Mon ami," Poirot said to Hastings, who had been standing by, his gaze shifting from Poirot to the door where Margaret had exited. "There is much more to this case than mere greed or deception." Hastings, who had been astounded by the depth of Poirot's deductions, nodded slowly. "I never imagined it would come to this." "You were right all along, Poirot." "You knew?" Poirot gave a modest smile. "It was merely a matter of using the little grey cells, mon ami." His eyes gleamed for a moment, and he looked out the window, watching as Margaret Montclair was led away. But what does that teach us? That human nature is complex. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect what they believe is theirs. They will kill, lie, and deceive, all to preserve the life they have created, no matter how fragile it may be. Hastings, still somewhat taken aback, looked toward Poirot. "But surely, Poirot, she deserves the punishment she will get." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, she will. The law will take its course, but I must say, Hastings, It is always a bitter thing to know that a person would go to such extremes. It
is one thing to catch a criminal, but another to understand the darkness that drives them. They stood there for a moment in silence, Poirot gazing out at the Montclair estate, his mind turning over the case once more.
I wonder, mon ami, he said softly, how many others, in the privacy of their own homes, have committed such acts, believing that their actions are justified. And I wonder, too, how often we fail to see the warning signs, too busy with our own lives to notice the cracks in the surface. Hastings opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. No, Hastings, it is not the answers we seek that matter most in life, it is the questions, for it is the questions that lead us to the truth, and the truth, though it may be painful, is the only thing that sets us free. The two men stood in silence for a moment longer, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Finally, with a small sigh, Poirot turned to leave the room. "Come, Hastings," he said, his voice light once more. "There is nothing more to be done here. We shall take our leave of this place and let justice follow its course. There are other cases waiting for us, no doubt." And with that they left the Montclair estate, the final chapter in their investigation now complete.